Well, thank you and good evening, and thanks for turning out. We tried to do something about the humidity outside, but we couldn't manage that, so I appreciate your coming. Gary, let me start out with why did you write this book?
First of all, before I get to that, let me thank Katie for setting this up, and welcome the fall from the stool, because I think I'm wired here much. If I move one way or another, I think I'll hit the ground, so forgive me for that, but it's great to see so many familiar faces. It must be a very slow night in Fairfax, and I didn't realize I owed so many people money. I'm sorry. Now, why did I write the book?
Why did you write the book?
To make a lot of money. No, I'm just joking. Through my career, I had an opportunity to work a lot of interesting cases. Are we getting some feedback on this? And a lot of people said you should write a book about some of these experiences, chronicling the evolution of the hostage negotiation profession. And so I decided I would take a go at it and see if I could incorporate within the book some lessons that would help people in everyday life with regard to negotiations.
All right, well, let's start with, give us a non-Hollywood definition of a hostage negotiator. What was your job?
Well, I think a hostage negotiator is the voice of a negotiation team with a law enforcement agency. And when someone is holding hostages, they're threatening suicide, they're engaged in an emotional outrage, law enforcement is responsible for responding to the scene, containing the situation to ensure that it doesn't spread and endanger other lives. And then it's the negotiator's job to try to diffuse the situation, to convince someone to put down a weapon and not harm themselves or someone else. Hence the title of the book, Stalling for Time. It often incorporates a bit of time for the emotional levels to subside, and an individual can make more rational and better decisions about coming out and not harming themselves.
Now, did this job exist when you joined the Bureau?
Well, it did. Crisis negotiations, as we somewhat call it now, and hostage negotiations began in the 70s. In fact, Mr. Tom Strentzright here was one of the early pioneers in the FBI. And guys like Tom and George Bedford from MPD in Washington are two of my mentors. So the business existed in the mid-90s and onwards. And we learned through trial and error the things to do and not to do to keep ourselves safe as police officers and also try to get lives out safely. Before that time, we would show up and we would say, come out or we're going to come in and get you. Mm-hmm. And the bad guys would say, oh yeah? I dare you. And we'd go in and people would get hurt.
That's the Elliot Ness method.
Pretty much.
It worked for him, though. It seemed to in the movies. That's the thing.
On TV, yes.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Your line of work, unless what you do happens in our neighborhood, which thankfully usually doesn't, all we know about what you do is what we see in movies and television. We see what you do through fiction.
Well, I think oftentimes Hollywood television has the depiction of the perpetrator pretty good. We still on? We on, guys? Okay, they have the depiction of the perpetrator pretty good, someone who's emotionally enraged, but they rarely have the law enforcement piece correct, in my opinion. You normally see a negotiator sort of winging it, shooting from the hip, and being manipulative and psychologically trying to better the person they're dealing with. In reality, it's a team process, and it's the demonstration of a genuine concern to get this person to come out and to not be harmed and not harm the hostages that they may be holding.
Well, we'll get into how that applies in some of the cases that you worked on in just a few minutes.
Sure.
You knew from an early age that you wanted to be with the FBI, didn't you?
My parents gave me to the FBI at a young age, yes. I tell a story in the book that I'm really regret putting in the book now because everyone that's interviewed me has brought it up. And I was about 12 years old, and I was watching the Mickey Mouse Club one afternoon, and some of you don't remember that, but it used to be a pretty popular show for older folks, younger at the time. And the young host of the show shows up at the FBI headquarters in Washington and interviews J. Edgar Hoover and talks about the job that an FBI agent does, chasing criminals, catching spies. I said, wow, that's pretty cool stuff. And then they capped it off by going to the firearms range and shooting the Thompson .45 machine gun. That was it. I was sold. My mom came home from work and I said, I know what I want to be. Forget this stuff about being a nuclear scientist. I want to be an FBI agent. And she went out and bought me a book on it, and that was it. From then on, that was always my dream.
But most 12-year-olds would probably be fascinated by a show about the FBI, but most of them won't stick to it. They'll go out into becoming a nuclear scientist or something. What kept you on that path?
There was, I'm not sure that I can answer that, Bill, but there was something I thought was intriguing about the profession. I thought it was, FBI agents were held in high esteem. I thought it was a the FBI motto, fidelity, bravery, integrity, I thought well spoke to the type of people that were attracted to the job, and I think people want to be involved in something that is important and makes a difference. And I was certainly no different in that regard.
Now, you also mentioned in the book that this was a time when the FBI was regarded perhaps in a different way than it is now.
Yeah, times have changed. When I first joined the FBI, and when Tom did right after the Civil War, local law enforcement around the country, to a much larger extent, depended on the FBI to provide training and guidance in a whole number of areas of work. That's a lot different now with the internet and the free flow of information, the exchange, traveling around the country doing exchanges. But at that point in time, the FBI, I think, played a pretty central role in providing guidance and curriculum. And that was the time where we started our negotiation program, and I think we had a great deal of influence on how these situations were addressed throughout the country.
But even through the 60s, when we went through the counterculture, the COINTELPRO, all the things that the FBI was dragged through the mud with, you still stuck with your ambition and decided to go with it.
I did. Those were tumultuous times, the Vietnam War, and we had Martin Luther King killed, Robert Kennedy. But for me, I saw a country that more than anything else needed the kind of steady, fair, holding up to justice sort of system that I felt the FBI represented.
Now, were you always the cool-headed type?
Well, some who know me well might disagree, but yes, I mean, I think I seem to have an ability to think clearly in a difficult situation. I quote Rudyard Kipling at the beginning of one of my chapters, and it's my favorite quote. It says, "When you can keep your head about you when others are losing theirs." I think also is the best way of describing the attributes of a really good and successful negotiator. Someone who, in the midst of a crisis, can keep their own emotions in check, has a lot of self-control, and begin to assess what's going on and begin to make and formulate some good strategies for resolving it peacefully.
And do it quickly.
Sometimes there's a good deal of pressure that takes place and some time constraints.
Because most of us could do that if we had 6 months. But you may have 6 hours.
Well, you have to be able to think on your feet. But also, I mentioned before, and I want to repeat it, we're typically operating in the context of a team setting. So if I'm the primary negotiator, I'm going to have a couple of wise sages like this at my shoulders saying, well, here's what we think, here's how we look at it, let's try this approach. Here's what I'm reading in the behaviors being demonstrated by the individual. So using that collective knowledge and experience, it gives us a leg up on trying to help this person get through this situation.
Now, the first story you tell in the book is one of those stories that probably we would never hear of unless it happened in our neighborhood. One of those stories that doesn't have the spectacular ending of a Waco or a Ruby Ridge or something. It's an ordinary case. Man abducts his estranged wife, their small son, holds up in a house in the middle of the woods. Why did you choose to open the book with that story?
It's a very dramatic story, and it is a bit odd in that it doesn't quite end the way that some of the other stories do. But I wanted to show the reader the emotional situations that typically we face. About 90% of what law enforcement negotiators face are emotionally driven situations. The individual that we're dealing with has no clear goal in mind. They're just acting on the frustrations that life has presented them. They don't have good coping mechanisms, and they're behaving in often a self-destructive way. That's what police most likely respond to, and FBI agents as well. So our job is really challenging. How do you convince somebody to do something when they don't need you for anything? They have no substantive demand. They merely want you to go away. So you've got to exercise some patient, active listening skills, communication processes to try to convince them that you genuinely want to see them come out of this and not be hurt and not hurt anybody else. It's not easy, but it's a successful. We have successful outcomes when we do this most of the time.
I'm amazed with a story like that one, how much the suspect is willing to believe.
Yeah, Bill's referring to a case where I talked to a man for over 10 hours in a remote farmhouse in Sperryville, Virginia, who was holding his former common law wife and their child. And their relationship had obviously been quite bad for quite a long time. He kidnapped her in Connecticut, and we found them in a farmhouse in Virginia. And I had to negotiate with him. And I was beginning to question my chosen profession when he came within seconds of killing her.